Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining our live webinar on differences and similarities of apprenticeships in Europe. My name is Letizia, and I'm a member of the Apprenticeship Support Services team at eChorus. My colleague Matt will be helping me today with the facilitation of the webinar. Joining me today is our senior expert and presenter, Jörg Markovic. He will be leading the webinar today and answering your questions.
Hello, everybody. While waiting for everyone to join us, Letizia will spend a couple of minutes to introduce you to some of the technical aspects of the webinar.
Okay. So thank you, Jörg. For those who are joining us for the first time, or as a reminder, I would like to explain to you all the functionalities that are going to be used during the webinar. So you should see on your screen to the left the GoToWebinar viewer through which you will view the presentation, and then to the right the GoToWebinar control panel where you can use the raise your hand button to engage with us, ask questions using the questions box, and select your audio mode. So can I ask everybody now to check whether you can hear me okay? And if you can hear me, please click on the raise your hand button so we can see that everything is working properly. Okay, perfect, thank you. And if you're experiencing any difficulties or issues, please send us a message on the question box. Okay, thanks. Just for your information, all attendees are muted automatically on arrival to the session. And you can listen into this webinar using your computer's audio or your mobile phone. So please select your preferred option in the audio menu at the top of the control panel to the right of your screen. If you select telephone, please follow the instructions provided in the registration confirmation email. As I have mentioned, we will be using the questions box to collect your questions during the webinar today. If you have any questions, please type them in the questions box at the bottom of the control panel to the right of your screen, and Matt and I will do our best to respond. If you wish, you can try using the question box now. So since it's summer, let us know your holiday destinations this year. While we are waiting, Jörg, can you tell us where you are planning to spend your holidays?
Well, Letty, you know, I've been on so many missions abroad and so many conferences, I will just stay at home. Also, the weather is so nice in Vienna, above 33 degrees every day, so no reason to go abroad.
Ah, nice. Fair enough. A bit of time spent at home is always nice. So I see that Julian is going to Tuscany and Fernando to Sicily, so a lot of Italian holidays this summer. But also Rita is going to Spain, so sounds really, really good. And Narcis is going to Costa Brava. So during the webinar, if we can, we will answer you individually to all the questions that you ask. But if the topic of your question may be of interest to all the attendees, we will make sure to forward your question and our answer to everyone. So please feel free to post questions at any time, and we will try to answer them as we go along in the question box. So during the webinar, our presenter Jörg will also have some questions for you. Please provide your answers in the question box. We will review your answers and invite Jörg to comment on them. We will also invite you to complete the short feedback survey at the end of the webinar. So this webinar session will be recorded. While we will monitor your participation during the webinar, it will not be captured in the recording unless any of your written questions are picked up by the presenter. We will send you a link to the recording after the webinar, and the webinar's recording will also be uploaded on the EAFA website. Thanks. So I see that we have more people that have joined now. So once again, hello and welcome to our webinar. Today's webinar will provide an overview on the differences and similarities of apprenticeships in Europe. Our guest speaker, Jörg Markovic, has been a key researcher in various recent comparative studies on apprenticeships for CEDEFOP. Furthermore, Jörg supported the European Working Group on Vocational Education and Training and drafted main parts of the publication High Performance, Apprenticeships and Work-Based Learning, 20 Guiding Principles, published by the European Commission in 2015. Jörg, I hand over the mic to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Letty, for the introduction. Welcome to this webinar on differences and similarities of apprenticeships in Europe. The aim of this webinar is to better understand differences between apprenticeship programs in Europe. We are all interested in how things can be done differently, aren't we? The variety of apprenticeship programs in Europe provides a rich resource for policy learning across member states. However, identifying differences is one thing, but understanding differences is another thing. To begin with, I'd like to give you an overview on my presentation. First, we'll have a look at previous comparative research about apprenticeships in Europe, and I will try to sketch major changes in the understanding of apprenticeship in the last centuries, very briefly only. Next, we need to touch upon the question of how apprenticeships are defined, and I will also give an overview on existing programs. But the core of my presentation is actually divided into two main parts. In the first part, we'll discuss the variety of apprenticeships in Europe by looking more closely at issues of financing, governance, curricula, and the like. And in the second part, I will focus on similarities between apprenticeship programs. And also I will introduce a model which I hope will help us to understand the differences between certain types of programs. To conclude, and if we still have time, I will reflect on current trends in apprenticeships at the moment and also on the future of apprenticeship in Europe. Let's see if we'll have time. Now, to start with, I've prepared this slide on comparative research on apprenticeship. As you know, apprenticeship as a particular mode of skill formation is currently very high on the agenda of international organizations and also many national governments. However, this was not always the case. On the contrary, other than university education, apprenticeships have been in and out of fashion over the past decades. As you can see here from the different periods of generations of comparative studies on apprenticeship. And I'm referring only to studies which focus at the European Union as a whole, at least at the time they were conducted. Well, the first comparative studies I know were conducted in the early 1960s. They clearly reflect the growth in construction and manufacturing industry after World War II and the rise of apprenticeship. Then in the 1970s and 1980s, the first big crisis of apprenticeships occurred, triggered mainly by the oil crisis, but also by the transformation of the economy towards a service-based economy. During this time, the focus was on new forms of alternate training and ideas how to reform apprenticeships. But still, the studies at that time were limited to a few Western European countries, at that time part of the European Union. Then in the mid-1990s, with the accelerated EU enlargement, for the first time, a larger set of countries was considered in a pioneering CEDEFOP study. Finally, and this is the period we're most interested in, after the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009, and the new political emphasis on apprenticeship as a means, in particular, to tackle youth unemployment, the number of studies and countries covered literally exploded, as you can see here from the references. But not only the number of countries included increased, also the scope of what is considered as apprenticeship increased over time. How so? Well, let us have a look at the changing notion of apprenticeship throughout the histories. Until the 1930s, apprenticeships were not so different from the traditional craft apprenticeships of the Middle Ages. The key principle at that time was the so-called master-apprentice relation, and all the rest, the duration, the financial compensation, as well as the after-job learning, if there was any at all, was quite flexible. But if we look at what happened in the 21st century, another principle became more important, the principle of duality. That is the combination of learning at the workplace and in school. Also, apprenticeships obtained a legal basis. The first laws on apprenticeship were established in the 1930s. So the major difference between this 19th century notion and the 20th century notion is this move from master apprentice principle to the principle of duality, and that it got a legal basis. But if we look at the more recent developments, we see another change. Still, apprenticeship were considered as the training for skilled workers in the 20th century, and occupation was at its heart. But if we look at what happened in the last 2 decades, we see the skilled worker level not anymore as the only focus, but we see it expanding to different levels, to lower levels and to higher levels. So there has been a shift also from the focus of the occupation to focus on qualification. And there seems also to be a shift from on-the-job learning to after-job learning. I'm not arguing here that these older notions have been fully replaced by newer notions. Rather, they live on in parallel, but to a different degree. So each period seems to have its dominant understanding of apprenticeship, and we are currently seeing a new notion evolving. I cannot put exact dates for these periods, but the first period, I would say, has gone until the 1930s. The second period is still ongoing, and it's a big question if this notion will fade out, really. But the new notion we are currently experiencing is something rather new, starting in the 1990s or 2000s. Now, let us now turn to the definition of apprenticeship. Well, if we look at the obligatory elements of apprenticeships as defined by the Council of Europe in the so-called European Framework for Quality and Effective Apprenticeships, these are the following 4. Learning that alternates between school and training in the company, learning which is recognized and certified, which means it leads to formal qualification, which is registered either in a national qualification framework or system. It involves either a work contract with the employer or a training contract or both. And finally, apprentices receive financial compensation, a wage or an allowance. This 4th criterion is stipulated in some, but not all definitions, you should know. Personally, I find this crucial. For many people, this is the key motivational benefit, that they are paid while they are in education. Some definitions also suggest that apprenticeships should be long-term programs. However, the minimum duration is much debated. Some say at least 6 months, others say a year. Most apprenticeship lasts around 2 or 3 years, actually. This, by the way, is also a major difference to traineeships, which usually are shorter than apprenticeships and not part of the formal education system. As you can see from the next slide, there are quite some differences in the international definitions of apprenticeship. As mentioned, the EFQEA definition refers to 4 out of the 5 criteria I just presented. CEDEFOP's definition of apprenticeship refers to all 5. CEDEFOP, by the way, for those who don't know it, is the European Center for the Development of Vocational Training, founded in 1975. Eurostat, which is the statistical office of the European Union, defines a minimum duration, but the definition does not refer to a training contract. Finally, a comprehensive study by the European Commission conducted in 2012 applied a quite broad concept of apprenticeship by including only 2 criteria, learning on the job and national qualification. Before I come to the consequences of these different definitions, I would like you to reflect on your own understanding and your own definition of apprenticeship. And this is the time for you to interact with me. So I'd like you to tell us about your national definition of apprenticeship. Does it differ from the international ones you just heard about? Are there maybe any additional criteria, or are there less than the 4 or 5 criteria I presented? Are there any specific features you would like to share with us of your particular national definition? Well, I invite you now to use the question box to answer this question, and I also would like to get some support by Letty on this.
Hi. So whilst you guys answer this question that Jörg just asked, Jörg, I wanted to ask you a question that Mick has asked. So he asks, what are the key barriers to mobility of labour posed by differences in apprenticeships model in different countries, and how can some of these barriers be tackled?
That's a very good question. Maybe we come back to it at the later stage of the presentation when I will introduce some of the basic models of apprenticeship, because by that I think we can explain this or try to give an answer at least. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So just to give you a bit of an overview of what people are answering, Rita says that it's CEDEFOP, whilst Ariana says that in Albania, for the young, they start at 14 years old until the age of 18. And Jörg says that he thinks that in his country it's the Austrian apprenticeship system.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do we have any more?
Whereas Maria says that in Portugal, she says, in Portugal, as I can know, there is a broad concept of apprenticeship. Basically, any experience on job, paid or not, is considered apprenticeship.
Yeah, I agree. This goes very much in line with how apprenticeships are understood meanwhile. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's more coming in.
Mm-hmm. So, sorry. So Manfred says, Manfred asks actually if there is in your interpretation a difference between WBL and apprenticeships, because in the Netherlands there is a minimum of WBL or traineeship, which is however part of the formal system. So
well, I have not presented my view. I have just presented the international definitions. But yes, I see work-based learning as a much broader concept than apprenticeship. So work-based learning can take many forms, whereas apprenticeship is a particular form of work-based learning only.
Thanks, Jörg. We have a question about potentially re-putting the questions. Okay, nothing, sorry. Okay. So Michael says that in Ireland, all 5 definitions are used. So the duration is 4 years from school to leaving age.
Yeah, whereas in the UK, the minimum is 1 year. But I know about shorter ones as well in the UK.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Thank you very much for your answers, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's go on then. Well, as there are different definitions of apprenticeships, there are also different ways to count them. And this slide shows you an estimation of how many apprenticeship programs there are. If you take a very broad definition of just work-based learning programs, saying at least 25% of the time spent should be spent in companies, this is what the ISCAT definition says, then we would have 80 apprenticeship programs in Europe. The European Commission study I mentioned, which also had a very broad definition and defined what they called apprenticeship-like programs, they found 70 apprenticeship programs in Europe. In contrast to, if we take a very narrow definition, the one provided by CEDEFOP, then we would come up with 30 apprenticeship programs complying to the CEDEFOP definitions. So even if we take this very narrow definition, there are only a few countries which have no comparable programs in place. However, the relative numbers of apprenticeships differ dramatically between countries. So countries with a very high share of young people in apprenticeship program are Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Norway. Also in Denmark, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, there's a remarkable share, while in most countries, though they have apprenticeship programs, they are rather small scale. And in some countries, they are really tiny, I have to say. Now, this is for the overview of apprenticeships in Europe as regards numbers and definitions. And let us now come to the main part, the first main part, on varieties of apprenticeship. So let me start with the key differentiation between what could be considered as work-based apprenticeships on the one hand and school-based apprenticeships on the other hand. Well, what's typical for work-based programs? In these programs, the student or the learner spends more time at the company, usually has an employment contract, they're considered as employees or as apprentices, and there is a high share of financing by enterprises. This is the case in Austria, in Denmark, in England, Netherlands, Norway, and a few other countries. On the contrast, there are also apprenticeship programs where students spend most of the time in school, at least more than 60 or 70%. They usually have a training contract, and apprentices are regarded as students. Also, the share of financing by enterprises is lower. This is the sort of apprenticeship system you find in Belgium, or at least in the Wallonian part of Belgium, in Croatia, Cyprus, France, but also Portugal and Spain. Now, when it comes to the curriculum, we have also two extreme models, so to say. One which we call integrated and another we call alternated. And the one is more or less what we have in continental Europe and the other one which we have in the north of Europe. So the one-phased or integrated duality is a situation in which the learner alternates between the two learning venues at a relative short interval, so from several days to several weeks. For example, apprentices attend classes for 1 or 2 days a week and work in the enterprise at the other 3 or 4 days of the week. In the Nordic model, on the other hand, this is a model which divides the training programs into 2 successive periods, so that a relatively long period of full-time instruction in school is followed by a phase of work-based learning in an enterprise. This is typical for apprenticeships in Denmark or Norway, and also known as the 2+2 model. So 2 years in school and then 2 years in the company. Certainly, these two forms are extreme poles, and in many countries, the form of alternation is also quite flexible and varies by trade or even by company. But still, it's interesting to keep these key differences in mind. Now, looking at target groups, there are also different target groups. In Austria, Germany, and Denmark, these are mainly young people leaving school. But already in these countries, there are remarkable differences. Austria has by far the youngest apprentices. So the starting age, the age at which students start an apprenticeship in Austria is 16 years on average. In Germany, in comparison, it's already 19 years, whereas in Denmark, it's 21 years. On completion rate in Denmark, on average is 28. But compare this, for instance, with Finland. In Finland, the average completion of an apprenticeship is 36. So this is a completely different apprenticeship system, if you like, in terms of the target group. It's a system for adults rather than for young people. In England, for instance, 40% of all apprenticeship starts are from people above 25. So again, England and Finland would be examples for more or less apprenticeship system targeted, or not say targeted, but used by adults. And finally, there are also apprenticeship programs which particularly address unemployed or early school leavers. For instance, the so-called apprenticeship programs in Portugal or the apprenticeship at the workplace in Romania would be examples for these. The latter in Romania, for instance, one has to be registered as unemployed at the Public Employment Service to be eligible for funding for the apprenticeship. Now, funding for apprenticeship is the next keyword. As you can imagine, apprentice pay differs also across countries, even if we control for purchasing power. The annual apprentice income depends certainly on how many numbers the apprentice work, but even if we compare apprentice pay per hour, there are remarkable differences from 2 to 11 euros per working week. So roughly, we can say there are three groups of programs. Programs with high pay, with an annual income of 9,000 euro or above. And if you calculate it by working hour, then the pay would be above 7 euro also. This is, for instance, the case in Austria, Germany, Denmark, England, but also Luxembourg and Ireland. The second group, medium pay, varies between 3,000 and 9,000 euros per year and 5 to 7 euro per hour. This is the case, for instance, for programs in Belgium, Cyprus, France, Greece, Malta, but also Estonia. And low apprentice pay would be below 3,000 euro per year, but sometimes it's even further lower, and below 4 euros per hour, for instance, for programs we find in Croatia, Hungary, Portugal, Romania, but also Poland. Now, apprentice pay varies not only between countries, but also within countries. So in most countries, or in most programs, you can say apprentice pay varies per year. So it's less in the first year and more in the third or in the last year, but it often also varies per trade. In some countries, it also varies by age and by level. So the group of countries where you have a large variation is, for instance, the Netherlands or England, also Germany, Denmark, Austria. There is quite some variation, whereas in countries as in Greece, Romania, or Cyprus, there is less variation. Now, looking at the governance of apprenticeship, there is also quite some difference, in particular if you look at social partner engagement, or more concretely, employer organizations. In countries like Austria, Germany, Norway, or Denmark, employer organizations are involved at all levels: the development of curricula, the assessment of apprentices, the quality assurance of work-based learning, and also they are responsible for the regulation or the registration of the contract. In countries like in Belgium, France, or Poland, this is not the case, at least not when it comes to the final assessment for apprentices, and in other countries, like in many southern but also eastern countries, social partners are much less engaged, which simply has to do with the extent of social partnership in these countries, which differs quite a lot in Europe. Now, talking about the differences, I think it's only fair if we talk about differences in the economic context. And this context can be more or less conducive for apprenticeship. Based on the varieties of capitalism approach, we can distinguish basically 4 types of skill formation systems, according to the involvement of firms in initial vocational education, and on the other hand, on the public commitment to vocational education. Now, this is very simplified, I know, but still it helps to explain a little bit of the differences of economic context and industrial relations. So maybe I'm going to use the pointer at this stage. Let me. So talking about the liberal type, this one is defined both by a low public commitment and low enterprise involvement. Training is largely unregulated and consists of a variety of courses and certificates offered by private training providers. This is the case, for instance, in the US, but also in England. Then we have the state-centered or statist skill formation system, where the public commitment is low, where the public commitment, is high, but the involvement of firms is low. Well, this is a situation we find, for instance, in France or Sweden, and we have mainly school-based VET systems there. Then we have the situation where both the involvement of firms is high, but the public commitment is low. The example given by the authors of this theory is Japan, and I don't know a European country following this system, but it would be nice to hear from you whether there are cases like this. And finally, we have what the authors call collective skill formation system, and this is where both the involvement of firms in initial VET is high and the public commitment is high. And this is typical for the dual training system in Germany. Now, clearly, apprenticeships can be established and flourish in any economy, but the argument here is that it's easier to develop them in collective skill formation system, where both the involvement of firms in VET is high and the public commitment is high. Now, I would be really interested knowing from you now whether you can identify with any of these types and whether you think your country has a conducive economic context for apprenticeship. So thinking about the economic context, the industrial relation, and also the skills policy in your country. Which type of skill formation regime does your country come most closest to? What do you think? Is it the statist skill formation, the liberal, the collective, or the segmentalist? Or if you cannot, if you think it's problematic because it's a mix of them, you can maybe just argue whether it's more or less conducive. And again, we can interact by using the question box. So yeah. And I also would like to ask Letty to come in again and help me in answering or getting an overview on the questions.
Thank you, Jörg. So we've already got a few responses now. So Narcis from Spain says that his model is statist, whereas Rita says that in Italy there are 3 types of apprenticeships. So the first type is statist, whilst the second and third are more segmentalist.
Mm-hmm.
And following on from that, Mike again says that Ireland is trending to the German model of high state and high company support.
This is a very interesting observation, which I share, by the way, and I think this is also the big difference between Ireland and the UK. So if we compare those two systems, which often are regarded as the Anglophone system, but when you look at apprenticeships, they couldn't be more different, I would say. So yes, I definitely agree.
So additionally, Jörg says that from his perspective, the Austrian, Swiss, Liechtenstein, and German systems are quite aligned on a high-level view.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah.
From India. Pooja in India says that it is more of a statist system, which is also because of low interest of firms to participate, and additionally the existence of a large informal sector.
There's a very interesting comment on the UK saying that they are shifting towards collective skill formation. And as an argument, Phil is mentioning the levy, which has been introduced. I think this is an issue to be discussed, whether the levy makes it more of a collective skill formation system. Very interesting point indeed.
Thank you very much for your inputs, everybody. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So let's go on now with the second main part. Wait a minute, I have to reorganize my screen here. Okay, let's come now to the similarities of apprenticeship systems. And well, I think the best way of trying to make sense of the common patterns of apprenticeship systems is to look at the key purpose of the different apprenticeship programs. Well, you can say that the key purpose, there are at least 4 key purposes, I would say, for any apprenticeship program. The first one is to educate and train the younger generation of a professional community, as I would argue. The second one is to develop the specific skills needed by enterprises. The third one, I would see, is to facilitate personal development of young people to become responsible citizens. And the fourth one is to increase employment opportunities for job seekers and integration into the labor market. Now, we can see any apprenticeship program as a sort of mix of these 4 key purposes, but also we can argue that with each of these key purposes, there is actually a specific education and training logic corresponding to them. So the first one corresponds to what I call professional education. The second one corresponds to what I call enterprise training. The third one, to which I call school or university education. And the fourth one, to what we can consider as public training schemes. Now, I know there are more and different aims and logics of education, but these are the ones which are relevant for apprenticeships, in my view. And let's see how this argument evolves by looking into the details of each of these logic. Now, let's start with the professional education logic. Well, the key purpose of professional education is to educate and train the younger generation of a professional community. For instance, a sector, a trade, or other communities of professionals. You can find this logic in many craft apprenticeships, but partly also in military education, social work, nursery, and so on. Consequently, the concept of profession or occupation and its change is at the very heart of this logic. The skills needed and training of content are usually negotiated by the members of the community, which usually consist of employers and workers alike. And the community also bears the cost of the training, but certainly aims for financial support by the state, which is granted to the extent there is public interest in the education. Now, what sort of apprenticeship programs would we expect following this logic? Well, first of all, these programs would focus on occupational or professional standards. They would be quite long because it takes time to become a full member of the professional community. They would be targeted mainly at young people between 15 and 25 years old. And their status as learner would be generally acknowledged, so they would be acknowledged as apprentices. We would further expect apprentice pay collectively bargained and little state subsidies. And overall, there would be a high degree of self-regulation, social partners involved in final examinations, and so on. Now, at the right, you can now see, and I will not read them through, apprenticeship programs in the various countries, which in my view follow this logic. Now, the logic of enterprise training. As I said, the key purpose of enterprise training is to make sure that the specific skills needed by enterprises are available. If the skills cannot be provided by restructuring or are available in the job market, enterprises may retrain or train staff. The typical form this sort of training would take on non-formal training courses, but also corporate university would be an example for this type of training logic. In this case, the individual enterprise defines the skills needed, and it enjoys substantial autonomy how to organize the training, because it usually also pays for. It certainly depends more on business cycles than other forms of instruction, as it is often regarded as an additional cost by enterprises, which can be cut in economic downturns. And the bulk of enterprise training this way would be non-formal on-the-job training. Now, apprenticeships, which follow this logic, what would we expect from them? Well, we would expect a highly diverse set of apprenticeship programs and qualifications offered. We would expect generally shorter programs and longer on-the-job learning periods because companies are interested in specific skills and seeing their employees being productive. It would also be characterized by a preference to offer training to existing, so older employees, rather than newcomers, younger ones, to avoid recruitment costs. And learners would be usually regarded as employees. Now, there is probably any apprenticeship program shares some features of this particular logic, and informal apprenticeships in development countries certainly follow exclusively this logic. In Europe, I don't think we have any clear-cut examples for that, but I would say that the apprenticeships in the UK come very close to these types of features. Now, the third logic I would like to refer to is the logic of schools or formal education, if you like to. Now, the key purpose is the personal development of young people to become responsible citizens, as I said earlier. The content of learning is usually determined by public authorities and oriented towards the needs of society in general, rather than the needs of certain professions or companies. Now, for an apprenticeship program following predominantly this logic, what would we expect? Well, certainly we would expect a higher share of school-based learning. Most of the programs origin from school-based upper secondary, where work-based elements have been strengthened. We would expect that the training institutions, so the schools, have ultimate responsibility for the learning process, which can take various forms. For instance, schools are partly or fully in charge of organizing work placements or the final examinations. And very often the work-based learning component is often perceived more as an extended traineeship rather than the main part of the training. Programs are not necessarily occupation specific, but may be oriented towards broader vocational fields like health, tourism, and other particular occupation. And students would usually be regarded as, learners would be usually regarded as students. What is also, there are two more or less clear criteria by which you can distinguish apprenticeship programs of this type from others, and that is that they usually provide access to further or higher education on the one hand, and that the qualifications can be obtained also via purely school-based tracks. Well, also apprentice pay in this type of apprenticeship programs we would expect to be lower than in the other two cases just presented. Now, here on the right, you can see a list of apprenticeship programs, all complying to CEDEFOP's definition of apprenticeship, which in my view follow this logic of school or university reasoning. You may have already spotted your program now, so let's come to the final type I'd like to introduce, and this is the logic of public training schemes. Now, the key purpose of any public training scheme of active labor market policy is to increase the employment opportunities for job seekers and to improve matching between jobs and workers. While most training is short-term and job-specific, it can actually take any form depending on the target group. It may also include language courses or basic skill training, so any sort of training. If we look at apprenticeship programs which follow this logic of public training schemes, what would we expect? Well, we would expect that they do not date back before the 1980s, when these sort of programs have been introduced. They would clearly address unemployed or other disadvantaged groups. They would be most would be temporary programs, learners perceived as participants, and the funding usually would call from Social Security budget, so the Public Employment Service or the European Social Funds. There are not that many programs of this type, but there are, and they are increasing. So we find, for instance, programs in Portugal, Romania, but even in Austria, there are programs which could be classified this way. Now, these are the four types of apprenticeship programs, or the four logics, which in my view can help to understand the different purposes, but also the different governance of apprenticeship programs. And here you just see a summary of the key issues or the key aspects of these four logics: the key purpose, the ownership, and the different funding. But I'm sure in the list I showed before, you have already spotted your programs and your program, and you probably would like to question my classification. So I think I should give you here also the possibility to come in with reactions, and simply would like to ask you whether you agree with the way I classified your apprenticeship program. And also would like to ask you whether you think this framework of four logic is helpful to explain current changes and trends in your national apprenticeship programs. So I give the floor to you and ask Letty to come in again.
Thank you, Jörg, for this. Whilst the others write their responses, I just wanted to mention a question asked by Richard. He thanks you for the presentation, and he also says, do you think it is possible to run a dual system with an all-age/all-level program, such as in England, or if dual system only works for younger people?
No, I definitely would say there is no age limit. So in my view, the concept of a dual system applies or would be possible for all age groups, but also all levels. So even not focusing just on the skilled worker levels, I can imagine a dual system for higher apprenticeship and for lower apprenticeship. So I don't see any limits to these. And we also see in countries with dual systems like Germany, Austria, and Switzerland that they are the average ages are changing, and we also see so there is more offer for adults now, and we also see the levels are changing. So they are introducing shorter programs, but also longer and more extended and higher programs. So I don't see any restrictions to that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Maria says that she agrees with what you were saying, and that there is a trend in the sense to engage and co-responsibilize more enterprises, and she says that they're having experiences with a dual system also, and this is a good practice according to her. So thank you, Maria, for for letting us know. And so it seems that people are agreeing with the logic.
I think there's someone
Julian,
saying that England, yeah,
yeah, so
England is a blend
Julian is saying
between.
that exactly. Julian is saying that England is a blend between professional education and enterprise training, but also focus on increasing employment prospects. So he finds your classifications very interesting.
I agree with England being a blend of these three. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I
James.
think it's also quite a challenge to introduce this third purpose, so to say, on increasing employment prospects. So this is an issue in England.
Mhm. Um, yes, so Mike also says that this is very helpful. It's a very helpful classification, but he says that he believes that it is more complex than shown, and that the boundaries are merged in many cases. So what do you think about that, Jörg?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we start with simplifications to try to get some grip on the differences, so to say. But for sure, any program is probably a mix of these four to different degree. But still, I think it helps if we can make these differences or these different purposes explicit and say also see the power struggles, so to say, between these logics, which certainly exist.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. One more question about the UK is that James asks if the UK levy system is used in other regions as well.
Pardon? What was the question again?
James asks, is the UK levy system used in other regions as well?
Well, there are levy systems in Denmark, in France, and in Hungary. These are the countries where we have national levy systems. There are a few other countries where we have sectoral levy systems, for instance, in the Netherlands, partly also in Germany. But there are big differences between the levy systems. So you cannot say that the Danish or the French levy system is a one-to-one comparison to the English one. There are big differences. But I think in due time there will also be a specific webinar on financing of apprenticeships. So I encourage you to attend this seminar. You will get more information on the differences of levy systems and financing models there.
Thank you, Jörg. And one last comment mentioned by Narcis is that in Spain there is an increasing presence of a dual system of the professional type, although most of the activity is in the two law systems in programs related to unemployed people and European guarantee projects and enterprise placements without salary and the consideration of students. So this is the situation in Spain at the moment. So thanks, Narcis, for your input.
Should we maybe now also try to answer the first question we got at the very beginning? What are the key barriers to mobility of labor posed by differences in apprenticeship models in different countries, and how can some of these barriers be tackled? Well, honestly, I still don't have a full answer to that, but I hope that these classification of different logics I have shown at least helps us to understand the differences and also the different purposes of apprenticeship programs. So it will be very hard to compare programs, in my view, across these different logics, and mobility within rather similar systems like, for instance, Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, Denmark, is certainly easier than between systems which are particular, for instance, addressed at unemployed or school leavers. So there is an issue here, I would say. But yeah, I hope this helps a little bit.
Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, I think we are running out of time. We have 6 minutes left as far as I can see, and we still want to do a very short feedback poll at the end. So I rather skip what I've prepared as regards trends in apprenticeship. Just maybe as an outlook, I'd like to mention that I'm currently working with a colleague on future scenarios of apprenticeships based on CEDIFOP's work on the future of WETs, and we distinguish here between three main possible scenarios for future apprenticeship in Europe. The one which we call fake apprenticeship, which is actually not a real apprenticeship, if you like. It's a sort of employability training, which exclusively serves the integration into the labor market. Apprenticeship as a brand, this is probably what we all want to have, which tries to balance educational goals and professional competence, and where the qualifications are highly valued, and it would be regarded as part of a broader WET system. And then we have apprenticeship as a label, which is probably what we are currently heading to. In this scenario, apprenticeship is becoming a buzzword with many meanings for diverse forms of work-based learning. So this is just an outlook at what we're working right now, maybe also a topic for a future webinar. But I would still like to give 5 minutes to Letty for the feedback survey. So that's from me. Thank you very much for listening, and hope to see you soon again at another webinar maybe. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jörg. So before we finish today, we would like to ask you to spare a couple of more minutes to answer our feedback survey. So your feedback is really very important to us and will help us to improve our future webinars. So to begin with, I would like to ask you your overall satisfaction with the webinar between being very dissatisfied and very satisfied. So we will give you a couple of seconds to answer this poll. Okay, thank you very much for your responses. We would also like to ask you, like to know if the webinar met your expectations. And we will give you a couple of seconds to answer, and then we'll close this poll. So thank you very much for answering these questions. Finally, if you found the webinar too long or too short, now is the time to say it for sure. So please let us know. Okay, thank you very much. We would also like to ask you which part of the webinar did you like the most? So please let us know in the next few seconds. All right, thank you very much for your answers. We would also like to ask you this question. So like, what would you would like to hear about in the next webinars that we will have? We'll leave you a few more seconds to answer this one because it's a bit longer. Great. Thank you very much for all those of you that responded. And lastly, we would like to ask you what other topics would you like us to cover during future webinars? So yeah, please let us know. Again, I'll leave you a few more seconds to answer these questions. Please don't be shy. Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you very much for this. So thank you very much for your feedback. And if you have any suggestions how we could further improve the webinar, please write them in the question box. And I'd like to ask Jorg to join me again, because we would just like to thank you again and let you know that this brings us to the end of our webinar today. Thank you all for the attention and the participation. We hope you found it useful. And do also keep an eye out on the Apprenticeship Support Services website for news and further information about the upcoming webinars. And the next webinar will take place in September, and the registration will be launched very soon. So thank you again for your participation, and yes, we hope to see you in future webinars. Thank you again, Jorg.
Thank you very much, and bye. Have a nice summer.
Bye. Thanks. Have a nice summer, everybody. Bye.